Namaste and welcome to a very special Bharatvaarta podcast brought to you jointly with the Conservative Friends of the Commonwealth. I'm Roshan Karyappa, and here with me hosting this podcast is Sunil Sharma of the CFOC. Hi Sunil, thank you so much for co-hosting with me.
Hi Roshan, I'm delighted to be back. Really excited to be speaking to Anil today and yourself.
Wonderful. So our esteemed guest for today is veteran journalist Mr. Anil Padmanabhan. He has written for several leading publications such as the Economic Times, Open Magazine, Khaleej Times, Mint, and India Today. He's also a Nieman Foundation Fellow. Anilji, great to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Roshan. Thank you, Sunil, for being here with us today. Look forward.
Right. So before we get started, let me offer a short preface to our discussion today. Over the last couple of months, the second wave of the COVID pandemic has ravaged through India. And it has been a difficult time for all of us, I would say. And indeed, many of us have been personally affected. There is plenty of interest both here and abroad about how things are and what we're doing to cope with this. So what we'll try to do over the course of the next hour with Anilji is to cut through the clutter and basically look at things the way they are. So Anilji, I think India was being lauded for its excellent handling of the pandemic. I think even up to March of this year, 2021, we were averaging about 20,000 cases or so daily. People had warned about a second wave. In fact, I think the Prime Minister himself had addressed this specifically with various chief ministers. But it all went horribly wrong very, very quickly. We peaked at about 4 lakh daily cases about 10 days ago. And then, since then it has declined. But, the second wave has been truly devastating for India. So what do you think happened?
Roshan, a bunch of things. I think we, as a country, collectively, we kind of took things for granted. And the kind of lucky break we had in the initial phase probably lulled us into a sense of complacence. So, and the virus obviously mutated, and the ferocity of this contagion that we are seeing at this phase is primarily because the mutated version has become very contagious. So, but I think it is a bunch of things have contributed. As a country, I mean, I know anecdotally, I don't have evidence for this, but if you walk around the street, there's a failure to assume or adopt appropriate COVID appropriate behavior. Fundamentally, to me, the problem is of wearing the mask. And we either don't wear it or we don't wear it properly. So we have left ourselves vulnerable as individuals. And clearly, to sum up, the virus itself also has been working. Just as we have been working to mitigate it, it's been working to counterattack. And so what we are suffering now is an extremely contagious version. And a bunch of things have contributed to our current circumstances.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we were just discussing before we started recording that, the virus this time seems to have affected people in the hinterlands as well, which was not the case earlier. Is it just again a function of a mutated strain perhaps? And, again, there not being any protocols or those kind of things in place, or do you see something else, behind it?
See, Roshan, I think let's just get a perspective on, I mean, this is the way I look at it. Maybe I'm a minority, but, this is a once in a century pandemic. I don't think we have yet absorbed that impact, which is exactly why, you have this COVID appropriate behavior is missing in our lexicon of the as individuals. Secondly, no country can create the medical infrastructure to deal with this kind of a pandemic. So look around you, you have the United States, Japan, Germany, France, UK. I mean, all of them were, dropped to their knees under the impact because the surge is phenomenal when it strikes. So no medical capacity can be created to deal with it. It's just not worth it. It's not economically viable to create such capacities. So barring China, I think every country has suffered severe blows because of the sudden surge in COVID, which has got a mismatched capacity. Also, in the Indian context, please accept the fact that this is a syndemic. It is not a pandemic. It sits on top of an already skewed disease burden, which is dominated by non-communicable diseases like heart attacks, diabetes, cancer, etc. So we have a layer of NCDs, and on top of that, we have been struck by a pandemic. So in the Indian context, we should look at it as in terms of a syndemic. So the odds, I mean, I'm basically explaining the odds to you of fighting this. But the point is that could anything have been done better? With the benefit of hindsight, 18 months or 16 months later, obviously, yes. But ex ante, if you could have done, I'm not so sure because there was no playbook. Okay, last epidemic of this proportion was seen about 100 years ago, and institutional memory is missing clearly. And so governments or public policy people cannot resort to any genuine playbook. Secondly, I think the larger thing is that, like I said earlier in the opening, the nation has been caught on the wrong foot. I think every one of the stakeholders, I'll just sum up a few of these stakeholders. Citizens, I've already mentioned about the mask issue. But if you remember from July, August, September onwards, the partying had begun. You could see the Goa partying, etc. Everybody, India had begun to move. The COVID fatigue. It was like they were breaking out of the COVID fatigue and people were moving around. I mean, even I'm sure you and I moved around at that point of time, assuming that the worst was behind us. We had the elections. You look at the big centers right now, West Bengal and Kerala. They're seeing an explosion in the COVID boom, which obviously is linked to the elections and the kind of, like I said, missing COVID appropriate behavior. And I think state governments finally also ignored the warnings, which is coming from several of the epidemiologists, several of the experts. They kept warning. I think there's one in Bangalore whom I follow very closely. I forget his name offhand, who's part of the Karnataka state government panel. And he has been warning from January, February onwards to prepare for a second wave. But state governments dropped the ball. So to sum up, collectively as a nation, we dropped the ball. But keep in mind that we do not possess the wherewithal to fight this kind of an epidemic with the right, we don't have the right kind of tools to fight this.
Right. Actually, that's a very important point that you bring up. I don't think it's intuitive enough to understand an exponential function of this sort. How quickly it can rise and so on, right? And we can obviously debate about, an increase in the percentage that we spend in healthcare and so on and so forth, of course, right? But, what you're essentially saying is there's no amount of spending or whatever that can prep you for something of this kind. But, I mean, large parts of the public, or at least significant parts of the public and the media, seem to be convinced that the state that we're in, we were caught underprepared, right? And the Modi government was complacent, perhaps ignored warnings, and were distracted by other things like the elections in Bengal that you mentioned, right? So to sum it up in a question, were we underprepared for the second wave, or if we were, what could the government have done any differently?
Roshan, like I explained to you a little earlier, that yes, the ultimate responsibility will be with the union government and the state governments. Because health, as we all know, is not just a union subject, it's also a state subject. Okay, so there is the ultimate responsibility will always rest with the political leadership in whether it's the state government or the union government. So having said that, like I explained to you, the circumstances are not such that you would have got a 10 out of 10 on your report card. You could have attempted a 10 out of 10. I'm saying that you were, to begin with, handicapped by the fact that you have as a public policy neglected health and education for the last 7 decades. So you have built in a legacy of neglect into a situation. You were able to mask these circumstances because you were never really challenged, like this instance, unfortunately. I mean, this is a very tragic way of learning such a obvious truth of your neglect, But the fact is that that's one of the primary reasons that not just the union government, the state governments too are handicapped. You are actually looking at the national picture, which is pretty good, okay, compared to what is happening at the states. Several states don't even have the capacity to address this issue. So they are struggling. So you are in a situation where capacity doesn't exist and people are scrambling capacities as we go along. So this is, like I said, a once in a century pandemic. There is no playbook. So you have to play it. I'm not saying that the government is absolved of its responsibility. Absolutely not. But there is a difference between fault and responsibility. So the problem today is we are all accusing the government or various governments of being at fault. I think that is a little unfair. We should begin with the responsibility and then ascribe responsibility and failure to deliver on that. Like the union government should have delivered on its ability to have got a head start, had a good break, should have anticipated a lot of these supply constraints, should have worked with state government. Similarly, state government should have got their act together, and we as individuals should have had our act together from day one in a fundamental job like masking. But I think we all let ourselves down. That's why I'm saying it's a collective failure. Let's not look to explore fault. I'm not letting anybody off. I'm saying there is a time for that. We should have a national scrutiny of this once this we handle this pandemic, and it should go through institutions like Parliament, because let it be in a democratic framework. It cannot be an accusatory tone that I accuse you of violations, etc. So it should be done in a democratic framework, and people should be held accountable.
Right. As you've described a couple of times, right? I mean, I think during this crisis, we've also become acutely aware of how the federal operating structure of the government is, right? I mean, clearly, some of the things that are aspirational to the center do not get translated across in the states. We've seen like fairly arbitrary sort of functioning, especially things like, lockdowns or even how vaccine is being coordinated and so on. Is there a need to fix something more fundamental, in your opinion?
You mean in the federal structure?
Yeah.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I don't think there's a problem with the structure. Our constitution is very sound, and I think it has distributed the powers very well between the center and states. And we have very capable political leadership in this country across the union government and states. So I have a firm belief that we have the collective wherewithal to figure out the blueprint. But having said that, I think we should recognize a few facts. This country is in the middle of a massive political churn for the last 7 years, since 2014. Till 2014, the principal pole of Indian politics was the Congress. Post 14, it is the BJP. So, when you have such a big transition happening, and it is an aggressive, ambitious BJP which is looking to assert its footprint across the country, so you're going to have more and more churn. So the political insecurities are going to be very high at this point of time, which means the center state, if they are not of the same regime, is inbuilt for conflict, which is why I think the union government has to take the leadership role in this, in either reviving existing institutions like the National Development Council, etc., or leveraging existing bodies like the GST Council, which to me is a great example of cooperative federalism. Here you had states which gave up their sovereign rights to tax, and we pooled the sovereignty of the center and states to create one of the most, I think the most biggest economic reform in post-independence of GST. And the GST body represents this federal structure, which is that the center is just the first among equals, but it does not carry a veto vote. So this is organized in a manner that the center cannot just dominate the states here. So if you have this backdrop, you obviously have a blueprint of how you should move forward. A calamity of this nature should have been approached in this context, is what I feel. And I think time is still not, we're still not lost, because increasingly going forward, issues like health, education, agriculture should be brought into the framework of not a GST council, but similar institutions where the center and state are equal partners.
Right. Speaking of political stakeholders as such, are you disappointed with some of the things that have been said and done? I mean, in a national crisis, we would have expected people to come together and really face this in a united front. But it has become sort of a political issue. We are seeing, either sides take stabs at each other. What do you make of this?
See, again, I don't know, the way I approach things is I always give a context. Please recognize that we are in a very binary era, my way or the highway. No, this is not just India. Worldwide, it's a phenomenon that we are living in a binary era. So you are going to have a constant yes and no situation. And on top of that, we have our human predilection where we like to see things in very simplistic terms. Whereas real life is extremely complex. It's in totally gray area. There's no black and white, right? So you are going to be, when you're in such a situation, I think it is incumbent on people in key institutions and people in heading key institutions to conduct themselves in a certain manner. So to me, the parliament is the starting point of all this. And if we are not able to conduct parliament in a democratic, in a collective framework, it's not that they started doing parliament, conducting parliament today. It's been happening since 47, 48, and differences have always existed. But there has always been a via media to resolve those differences. I gave you a very recent example of the GST Council. So the most acrimonious issue for the last 25 years. It's not something the Modi government thought of. They just took forward an existing proposal, but they could pull that off. But I don't see that happening in other spheres. So we let things drift, and then they become these inclement situations of yes and no. And that to me is what is creating this structure. So if you look at a WhatsApp group, they're all in the binary format. It's yes and no. I mean, you agree to me or you disagree with me. There's no dialogue. So we have eroded the middle space in our democratic framework, and which is what is creating problems. So if we want to move forward, we need to reclaim the middle space, expand it. So give the space for a dialogue between the left and the right.
Right. I think, that's a very profound point and probably explains multiple other things that we're seeing. The panacea for all of these ills quite literally is vaccination and maybe achieving some kind of herd immunity. We have vaccinated about 140 million people in India as of now, or roughly about 10% of our population. In your opinion, how has the vaccination rollout been coordinated and conducted? Anything we should do differently?
Roshan, to me, again, we have an advantage of hindsight analysis, while whoever is in the front line has only ex ante calls, right? They don't have our luxury. So, but I don't mean to justify missteps. I'm just explaining because I think it helps us understand, because the whole idea of this conversation is to help us understand what's going on around us. And I see my job as a journalist just that, explaining things as it is. It's up to you to make your own conclusions. So, from the beginning, we knew there was a vaccine shortage issue. It's not new. Okay, let's go back to something like December. In December, we knew the world would come with a vaccine, but then the efficacy was a big issue. If you look at the debate in January in India, it was a very acrimonious debate where people were questioning the efficacy of the vaccine. It's not just politicians, even experts were throwing their weight into it. And it became a very acrimonious exchange. So, while other governments in the world, let's take the United States, for example, they paid like I know the AstraZeneca deal, where the Americans paid $1.5 billion upfront for the AstraZeneca vaccine, which they have not even allowed use in their country as of now. Okay. Whereas the Indian context, in such a background where the efficacy is questioned, we don't know how the vaccine will, what state and form the vaccine will be in. We were, I think, diffident in our approach to the vaccine. Looking back, if I had this information I had today, we would have said we should have put $1.5 billion down in September, October last year. But you couldn't have, given the kind of information flow. But being a developed country and being a developing country, please recognize the difference. So I think you had to create a triage, given that the supply of vaccines is not low. So I was just looking at some UN data, and the United Nations, they just published it on their site. And they say up to June, the first 6 months, we'll be producing about 7.2 billion vaccines globally. Clearly, given the population of the world, this is not even good for one round of vaccine for every citizen of this world. Okay, so we are short there. You're going to make this up in the next 6 months when 15.2 billion vaccines will be produced worldwide. So you are going to see a situation which will ease beginning July 1 onwards in a increasing, like in amplified impact as we move along, right? So which means, like I said, go back to, we had to triage. And there, in my view, the union government did a smart thing. They zeroed in on the frontline warriors, which are the nurses, doctors who have really been the heroes of this battle. And of course, regular citizens who have been helping everybody around in an incredible way, as we all have seen in the last month or so. Then they extended it to those above 60, the general populace. Then they lowered it to 45. But simultaneously, there seemed suddenly there's a frenzy in the country, whether it's orchestrated or otherwise, I do not know. But it became a frenzy that, we needed to extend this to other people. And so the state governments need to be more empowered, etc. The debate came up. And I think this is where the union government missed a step. They succumbed to that kind of pressure for whatever reason, and they opened it up. Now, what have you done? Okay, like I explained to you, the first 6 months, you do not have vaccine supply in the world. So you are where India as one unit would have gone and demanded vaccines and probably got a good negotiating price. Now, multiple players are going to go and bid for it. So you have messed up an already bad situation. So we have gone from bad to worse. So yes, the vaccine rollout could have been done in a much better way. But I guess if we had had a national collective conversation, we probably would not have had this situation. But this is all like hindsight knowledge.
All right. Yeah, so this is pretty fascinating. I'm going to hand over to Sunil. I mean, he can ask his questions going forward, and then I'll come back in.
Thank you, Roshan. It's really been good to get this sort of context on what's going on in India with both yourselves. I want to start with the media coverage. So here in the UK, we've had a lot of coverage of what's going on in India. We had it initially with Italy. I don't know if you remember, right at the start of COVID-19, Italy got a lot of criticism. And then as time went on, we started to realize, well, actually, one of the reasons is there's a lot of Chinese people that actually go to Italy when we got context. And also Italy has a generally an older population, hence why there's more likelihood of people dying. Then I think we saw we were sort of about criticism, so our own media were criticizing our own government, our own people. Then it moved on to France, then it moved on to the USA, and now it's moved on to India. And I particularly liked what you said, I know, about the sort of responsibility and fault aspect. That said, what do you make of the media coverage of India's second wave? Because in this country, they're receiving a lot of scrutiny, just like those countries I mentioned earlier. Now it seems to be India's turn, where there seems to be quite a lot of criticism towards, in particular, the government. What's your general take on how the media is covering in India's second wave?
Sunil, to me, there are more misses than hits in the media coverage. I mean, I'm also part of them, but I'm just, so I'm equally culpable. So I'm not holding myself aloof from them. But what has worked for them is that they have not hesitated to ask tough questions of the union government. Okay, so they have forced attention on things like ICU shortages, oxygen shortages, etc., which was very good. And the idea of getting help to people and the certain issues like the migrant crisis, all these issues, you may question them on the amplification, but the fact that they focused on it got the attention that these cohorts deserved. And to me, that's a big plus. which is what journalism is all about. The problem is that they've been selective. So the same scrutiny that they have applied for the union government, they have failed to apply for several state governments. So which I found very odd. Okay, that then I think to me, the larger problem the Indian media and the world media, not just Indian media, suffers from, if it bleeds, it leads. So when I started out in journalism, I still remember that's what they told us in our orientation. If it bleeds, it leads. So that time we were very young, and we were very impressed with this idea. It bleeds, it leads. Basically, they were telling you should have good news sense. Okay, but we have, I think, taken it to another literal extreme. Not just India, worldwide we have taken it, and that's a larger reason to it. If you read Morgan Housel's book, the seductiveness of pessimism. So he says that pessimism is very seductive by nature. So if I tell you a story that a massive catastrophe is going to impact XYZ country, your attention, I get your attention. But if I tell you a massive good is coming by the way of XYZ country, you will, first of all, you'll doubt me. Second, you'll say, okay, what's the big deal? I mean, it's good news. Fine. You shrug your shoulders and move on, right? So I think that's at the back of our mind. So we have, and today in today's eyeball culture, where TRP ratings, eyeballs, then all these new metrics that are floating around because advertising is linked to them. A lot of newsrooms are falling prey to this. So you can see the kind of stuff that gets in. So in conclusion, what I want to just say is that what we forget is that we live in a very transparent era. See, if I did all this, probably I did all this in the 90s, 80s, etc., but nobody knew because the communication system was not so fungible, right? So today, everybody knows everything in a flash. And what journalists very often forget, which we used to share in our newsroom when I used to work in a regular newsroom, is that be careful about what you say in public, particularly in social media. So if I say tweet, nasty things about Roshan and you, and then I write a profile of both of you, if a neutral person is reading, they say, no, this guy is colored. He has a point of view, already has a point of view on both of them. And then he's writing the so-called neutral view, objective view on both of them. So they will doubt me. So you see, what today my readers read more than I read. Okay, it's just that they don't read as much as I write, but they do read more than I read. So they're far more informed than I am, but rightly or wrongly. That's a separate issue. Because I'm a firm believer in curation, because the kind of garbage that goes through in social media won't happen if you have curation. Okay? So to me, the media's role cannot be seen in black and white. It's a mixed thing. If I can sum up in the end, it's both good and bad. But right now, we need introspection as much as this nation needs introspection.
Do you think that some of the scrutiny has been a bit harsh? For example, in our country, we've not really held back at all on any country, whether it's Italy, UK, our own government. And me personally, as it says it in my title, I belong to the Conservative Party, and I would like my party to be scrutinized, but in the right period of time, where this is still relatively new, a virus that we're still trying to understand. I still want my party and I want my leader and I want them properly scrutinized. I'm just not sure right now is the right time to start blaming or starting to pass responsibility on to governments. And I've always had sympathy towards whether it's politicians I like or don't like, whether it's Modi, whether it's Conte in Italy, whether it's Trump in America or Biden in America. I've always had this kind of sympathetic view, which is let me understand what's going on in the country first, different population densities, there's so many different things. And then when the time is right, let's really understand what India could have done better. Is that happening now, or are we seeing a kind of the Modi administration really being attacked? Because again, on the UK perspective, it's pretty negative, and there is a kind of blaming towards the administration in terms of the healthcare of the last 7 years, the lack of sort of support. Is that something we're also seeing in India as well, or is it slightly different?
No, Sunil, it's very similar here too. So we mirror, and that's why I said it's the world today is pretty fluid. What you see in the UK, you see a mirror image in India. So absolutely, there's no doubt about it. But to me, just to be the devil's advocate here, this is the nature of the beast. It's a news cycle. So, it's like, say, a volcanic eruption happens. Are you going to report to the volcanic eruption first, or are you going to report to the cause of the volcanic eruption first? So, you will report the cause later, right? But right now, you need to focus on the news. So, it's the nature of the beast. In a news cycle, you chase that. But to me, what worries me is that you're slipping in, often we slip in views as news. That is a no-no. Okay, because in any newspaper, why do you think a newspaper or portal or anywhere else, you will always see an opinion section. I'm talking of curated establishments. You'll always see an opinion section. There's a logic for that. In our newsroom, there was a kind of Chinese wall between us, and the views team. Though I was the managing editor, so I had oversight of everything, but yet we would not interfere in the views section at all. So they were free to run their views because we were running the news ops and we didn't want the two mixing up. So we were very careful about that. So there were efforts to cut out the views, even if reporters slipped it in. There was a copy desk which addressed that. I'm not sure that's happening across newsrooms all over the world and in India. That is to me a bigger worry. The rest, they're all doing their job. And to be fair, it's a very tough job to report on an epidemic, pandemic, when you yourself are vulnerable to it.
I can imagine. I mean, the news one, I think we probably talk about quite a bit. It's similar, I think, in the UK, where we often joke as conservatives, like to be part of BBC ITV, you almost have to sign a document, which is you have to be extremely socially liberal. You have to believe in these values, and then you can report the news. If you don't believe in these values, then you can't report the news. But I think we'll probably save that for another day. I want to ask what you think the government should do now, going forward, in terms of reducing the impact of the second wave.
I think we should, first off, I'll keep my fingers crossed, because I don't believe anybody in the world has, barring China, comprehends the nature of this virus and the kind of damage it will do and its longevity. Everybody is, like I said, right up front, there is no playbook. We have been completely blindsided by this. So everyone is making guesses, first guesses, second guesses, and so on. And like in the UK, for example, you have unwound your lockdown, and now the new strain is taking hold. So you're, like you said, now you may be forced to go back, or at least have a staggered lockdown. So let's keep our fingers crossed, that going forward. So I just hope in the Indian context, we take the right lessons. To me, the biggest lesson of this, of course, beyond the human tragedy that we are seeing still unraveling around all of us, we have lost a lot of near and dear. And is that recognize the fact that you have dropped the ball on the health infrastructure. So you need to fix this, like not yesterday, not day before yesterday, like 2 years ago. Okay, so that's the urgency with which you need to approach this. So you can't look at it in percentage of GDP, etc. Okay, that I think we should dump these ideas. We should approach it very differently. I mean, I'm not an expert. I'm just throwing ideas out there. There are many experts in this country who can, I think, easily equipped to deal with it. And so the medical infrastructure needs to be, at least a semblance of it has to be put in shape immediately. Secondly, we do know certain demands that come when the wave strikes. So ICU, oxygen. So you need to create infrastructure, temporary at least, in terms of, whether you repurpose stadiums, schools, whatever it is, over the next few weeks and months before the next wave strikes, which is inevitable. As you unwind, it'll come back and then it'll come back. I think this is going to be a battle of attrition between the virus and mankind. So hopefully mankind will win this battle, but it's not going to be an easy battle to win. So to me, that would be the second. And uh, the issue is that we be conscious about all these issues, the way we approach this. Do not avoid missteps of the past. You will make missteps, fresh missteps, inevitable. Like I said, it's a new challenge. There is no playbook. But do not repeat your past mistakes. So be prepared to make fresh mistakes, build in a resilience. I think basic teamwork should be there. And to me, I'm a little flummoxed. Like, for example, uh, which I should have omitted telling you earlier, that we don't even have a national database on the medical infrastructure in this country. Like when I was researching to do a column 2 weeks ago, I was shocked. I had to run around. I asked so many people. Nobody had a clue. The only database is of public sector. Doesn't include the private sector. And just to give you an idea about how badly off we are in infrastructure, I'd made some. I mean, that time in my column, I had mentioned this. India is approximately there's finally a non-profit put together a database. So I used their database in March last year. So they say 1.9 million hospital beds we have, 95,000 ICU beds, and 48,000 ventilators. You tell me, how can it cope? The cumulative infections as of today is 29 million. I'm not saying all 29 million happened on one day, but even if a fraction of that happened on any day, your medical infrastructure was just not in place. So recognize this problem first. So have a medium term, short term plan in place and a mitigation plan in place.
I think it's really good getting that context on the medical situation of India. I actually want to follow on a point from Roshan on the federal sort of structure and state structure of India. For our sort of listeners in the UK, they may not fully be aware of how it's worked in India. So for us, essentially, Boris Johnson decides when we're having a lockdown and when we're not. We had recently, towards the end of last year, structured kind of, like you were saying, a staggered lockdown to certain areas where like tier 1 to tier 4, depending on which area you live in, your restrictions were different. In India, obviously, you have state intervention, federal intervention. How has it worked in terms of lockdowns, and what sort of power do state government have versus federal government? I think it'd be good for some of our listeners to kind of get that understanding.
Okay, the way the Indian constitution is structured, it's a 3-tier governance structure. You have the center, the states, and then you have the third tier, which is municipalities, corporations, etc. And of course, the panchayats at the bottom of the pyramid. But the way the lockdown worked was, last year we had a national lockdown, where the union government used its powers under the NDMA to impose its national call. So everything was locked down. But subsequently, they started calibrating this and they started empowering the states, because not all states are uniformly impacted. So they were smart enough to recognize that, and they realized that the debate between lives and livelihood was getting hurt. While you were saving lives, livelihood was getting hurt. So in that trade-off, they started recalibrating the freedom on lockdowns and started empowering the states. So by around November or September onwards, the states were equally empowered to impose lockdowns. The center always holds the right to impose a national lockdown, but they have made it clear that we will not go in for another national lockdown. In fact, I was listening to Prime Minister Modi today, and he was saying that it has to be containment zone. So he is going down to literally to a little bunch of flats. I mean, he's going down to that level because he's trying to dissuade everybody from moving into general lockdowns like the ones we are seeing now. So the states have been very empowered to carry out their lockdowns. And within states, some states have a lockdown, like in Assam, for example, they have said that it's lockdown between 2 and 5 a.m. every day. And then they keep changing it. On weekends, it's complete lockdown. So different states have followed different timetables. Maharashtra has followed different timetable. Delhi has followed a total lockdown for the last 3 weeks now, and so it varies. So Karnataka has a different. I'm sure Roshan can fill us on that. They have a different format altogether. So there's a timetable is varying across the country. It's not uniform. So Kerala just started a complete lockdown after the infection started clocking some 50, 60,000 a day. So they have put in a complete lockdown, which I think they will extend. So lockdowns are now, states are very empowered to do as they want. And then at the local district level too, the district magistrates, the administration controls a lot of things too. So they have, so the calibration is it's not uniform. That's what I'm trying to say. It varies, unlike say in the UK.
Right, that makes sense. I'll finish before passing back to Roshan on sort of general question on the political impact for the Modi administration. What kind of impact do you think that this will have this year or so that we've had of COVID-19 and now the second wave? How do you see that impacting his government and his future and like in politics?
Sunil, I wish I had a crystal ball to tell you. At least I could have monetized my guesses, but I don't have a crystal ball. But I can just make informed guesses. So it's an oxymoron, but it's an informed guess. But the thing is that let's prima facie, yes, PM Modi's and the union government's image has taken a beating. They have not managed the optics well, and it has definitely taken a beating. But the Modi halo still shines. Okay, so in popularity ratings, I don't think there's a match even today. Okay, but having said that, there are certain structural fault lines that have we always known and discussed, but have now clearly amplified because of the pandemic. One, this union cabinet has a serious bench strength and player abilities. So, this business of some ministers having an overload of several portfolios, etc., it is always a bad idea. It is now turning out to be a super bad idea. Okay, your ability of your cabinet is not uniform. See, all this is hidden when you're in good times. In bad times, all your warts gets exposed. It's like a incoming tide and an outgoing tide, right? So you suddenly see the seabed and you say it's not as pretty as when you look at it when there's a tide, there's an incoming tide. So to me, net, things they have taken a knocking, but it is not a fatal knocking. It's not apparent to me unless I'm missing it completely. And the one thing working for the government even now is there is no national opposition. They have found regional opposition like they found in West Bengal or in other selective states. They are running into walls, but nationally the opposition is missing because that can only come from the Congress party, which is, as you know, over 130, 140-year-old party, and they have completely imploded. So in that vacuum, there is no alternative national force which has stepped in. And at this point, but to assume that it will not happen, I don't believe that. I think like the Gita says, or even the Bible or all these holy books say, one thing constant in this world is change. So we can't assume status quo is going to go on. Let's see. But it is a political challenge to PM Modi, and let's see, because this is not the first challenge he has faced, but probably in terms of a tragedy, this is the first his government has faced. Probably first in a century. So clearly the first any government has faced.
Yeah, I think I'm reminded of the Gujarat earthquake actually early in his term, right? And yeah, I mean there were plenty of positives politically, at least coming out of that for him specifically. This has been a fascinating conversation, sir. I think we've discussed plenty of different aspects. You brought about a lot of profound things that make us ponder about these things a little more deeply. looking ahead, what do you see as the economic prospects for India? September, October, I think the PMI indicators, everything seemed to show that, things were going to come back to normal. GST collections were better, so on and so forth. And then we've been beset by this tragedy, right? So how do you see things on the economic front going forward?
Roshan, I just wrote about it on Monday. I read a column on Substack.
Yeah.
If I might do the PR for it here. So it's under Capital Calculus 2.0. Please check it out. So I coined a new paradigm saying stop, look, and go.
Go.
So like in a red light, you come to a stop, then you look at orange and then go at green. Problem with our economic framework today is exactly that. You have come to a dead stop because of lockdowns to combat the pandemic. Now you are, as it winds down the peak, you're going to the look phase, and you will start basically unwinding the lockdown in a calibrated manner, and then you will say go. But you're going to lose time. So you've already lost a month, you will probably lose another month. So if you're 12 months in a year, if you're going to have another wave, so you're talking of 4 months lost. So your growth, I'm just going on a thumb rule. It can be more complicated than what I'm explaining to you. But the gist of my argument is that you're losing time. So what was a full 12 months? You're actually going to get the benefit of only 7 to 8 months. That's going to hurt. So our economic prospects are not in the doldrums like it was in the first quarter of last year, but it is not where we thought we would be. So start recognizing this, and we should go back to the drawing board. Everybody, companies, individuals, budgets, the union budget, state budgets, because what you presented in March is redundant today. So you have to go back to the drawing board. So, and it's not that it can't be done. Challenges will always come your way. It's their job. It's like it's my job to write in a situation like a pandemic. It's my occupational hazard, right? So same way, every occupation is occupational hazard. They have to go back there and revisit, but recognize the fact that the scenario we painted in January is gone for now. We may rebound. I'm not saying we won't rebound, but I'm saying recognize the certain reality that lockdowns are going to be part of your lexicon going forward. And if that's part of your lexicon, your growth is not what you're projecting it to be.
Right. So, I'd like to end on a more, let me put it this way, like a more memorable note. This period has also brought out the best of all of us, right? We've seen everyone, including private enterprise, like of the range of Jindal to Tata to Ambani to even startups, right? I was talking to a couple of founders last week who had pivoted their product to serve leads for oxygen and ICU and hospital beds and so on and so forth, and have affected about 400,000 people or more. And we've seen that people coming together in apartment societies and so on and so forth. So in some sense, everyone has come together in the crisis. What are, one or two of your memorable events and things that you will remember, maybe looking back at this couple of years down the line or whenever we're past this?
Oh, Roshan, you have hit the nail on the head. I think that is the biggest takeaway to me of this pandemic, is that individuals, strangers have not hesitated to help strangers. You are probably, I listened to the podcast you're referring to, where you talked of these two people, you spoke to them, but the app they created, the artificial intelligence chatbot they have created to locate oxygen facilities. They have helped, like they said, 400,000 people whom they don't even know.
Yeah.
And nobody told them to do it. They gave up their line of business. They gave up their opportunities. They dived into the cause. In my personal experience, a friend of mine called me because his colleague, whom he had never met, was down, young guy, about 30-year-old, comorbid, was suffering. He needed remdesivir. So I called a classmate of mine from school who said, Anil, I've got one line with me. You take this, you need 4, we'll arrange the other 3. And you won't believe it, it's not a cheap drug by any chance, as we all know. And this guy refused to take payment. He said, let this boy recover, then I'll send you the bill, let me know. That to me, is the biggest takeaway. It's very, the humanitarian, the human in everyone has come out. I just hope we hold on to it, even in the good times that will come our way. And let's not forget this moment, because this is what, this is how a nation's bond in a collective. It's like a war, and we have come together as individuals. I mean, there will always be these bad stories, but I believe life is always a half full cup and not a half empty cup.
Right. Yeah, this was a wonderful moment. And thank you so much, sir, again for being on the podcast. Really fascinating to listen to you. And I think we covered a wide breadth of things here. And thank you also, Sunil, for co-hosting this with me. And thanks everyone for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Roshan. Thank you, Anil.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Bharatvaarta podcast. If you want to see more content like this, then don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We started Bharatvaarta to facilitate long-form discussions on politics, policy, and culture. We don't necessarily endorse anything that was said in this episode. If you wish to offer us feedback, do reach out to us on social media. We are at Bharatvaarta on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You could also get in touch with us on our website, www.bharatvaarta.in. The links are in the description below. Until next time, stay safe, take care, and Jai Hind.